Some Hollywood stories are remembered for the laughter they brought to millions, while others are remembered for the tension that never truly disappeared once the cameras stopped rolling. For actress Nancy Culp, fame came with a price, and the price was sharing the stage with someone who seemed to embody everything she opposed. Behind the smiles of the Beverly Hillbillies lived a simmering hostility, one that stretched beyond the set and later cut into her personal ambitions. What began as a clash of personalities would eventually turn into something far more personal and far more painful than anyone watching the show could have ever guessed. 2 lives before Hollywood collided. Long before they found themselves standing side by side on the set of the Beverly Hillbillies, Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen had already lived full and fascinating lives that could not have been more different. Nancy was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in 1921, the only child of Robert and Marjorie Culp. Her childhood was one of discipline and education. Her father worked as a traveling salesman, while her mother became a teacher and later a school principal. By the time she was in her 20s, Nancy had already earned a journalism degree and was working for the Miami Beach Tropics newspaper. She interviewed figures like Clark Gable and even European royalty, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. But Nancy's ambitions reached beyond writing. When World War II erupted, she left behind a promising career to enlist in the U.S. Naval Reserve, where she rose to the rank of lieutenant, junior grade. It was an unusual path for a young woman in the 1940s, and it showed her determination to build a life on her own terms. Buddy Ebsen's early story could not have been more different. Born in 1908 in Belleville, Illinois, and raised in Orlando, Florida, Buddy grew up far from the structured world of Nancy Culp. His passion was performance, not writing or discipline. He and his sister Vilma created a vaudeville act and eventually made it to Broadway. By the 1930s, the Ebsens were appearing in MGM musicals, dancing alongside some of the biggest stars of the day. Buddy's lanky frame and easygoing style made him stand out. He performed with Shirley Temple, and his movements were even studied by Walt Disney animators to bring Mickey Mouse to life. Yet fame didn't come without setbacks. In 1939, he was cast as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, only to suffer a near-fatal allergic reaction to the aluminum makeup. Hospitalized and replaced, Buddy had to watch as someone else stepped into what might have been his breakthrough role. By the 1950s, both Nancy and Buddy had established themselves in Hollywood, but in very different ways. Nancy had started as a studio publicist at MGM before a director convinced her to try acting. She soon became known for quirky supporting roles in television shows like I Love Lucy and Maverick. Buddy, meanwhile, had built a reputation in westerns and dramas, often cast as down-to-earth characters who seemed trustworthy and strong. Their paths were not yet directly intertwined, but the collision was inevitable. When the Beverly Hillbillies debuted in 1962, their destinies became linked forever. The Beverly Hillbillies and on-screen success. When the Beverly Hillbillies premiered on CBS in September 1962, few people expected it to become one of the biggest sitcom hits of the decade. The series told the story of the Clampett family, simple mountain folk who suddenly struck oil and moved into a Beverly Hills mansion. Viewers immediately fell in love with the fish-out-of-water humor, and the show shot to #1 in the ratings. Millions tuned in every week to watch Jed Clampett, played by Buddy Ebsen, try to keep his family grounded amid the luxuries and absurdities of Hollywood wealth. Buddy Ebsen was perfectly cast as Jed. He brought a warmth and steadiness to the role that audiences trusted. Jed might not have had formal education, but his common sense and quiet wisdom made him the anchor of the Clampett clan. His gentle manner and homespun sayings, like his famous "well doggies," became a part of American pop culture. For Buddy, after years of setbacks and supporting roles, Jed Clampett was the character that finally gave him the spotlight he had long sought. Nancy Culp, meanwhile, found herself in a role that would define her career. As Jane Hathaway, the efficient bird-watching secretary to banker Milburn Drysdale, She was witty, loyal, and always caught in the middle of the Clampetts' antics. Unlike the glamorous leading ladies of the era, Nancy didn't fit Hollywood's conventional mold. Instead, she leaned into her uniqueness, bringing sharp humor and emotional sincerity to the character. Audiences loved her for it, and in 1967, she received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series. On screen, Jed and Jane were an unlikely but engaging pair. Jed was the calm patriarch. Jane was the practical secretary who often tried, unsuccessfully, to inject logic into chaotic situations. Together, they were part of the chemistry that made the Beverly Hillbillies such a hit. But off-screen, their working relationship was far less harmonious. Behind the camera, Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen discovered they had little in common. Their personalities clashed, and more importantly, their political views were on opposite ends of the spectrum. While the rest of the cast often spoke fondly of the show's family atmosphere, those who paid close attention noticed the tension between Ebsen and Culp. To the outside world, it was invisible, masked by professionalism, but for those on set, it was clear. The laughter on screen did not always carry over once the cameras stopped. The clash behind the cameras. While audiences saw warmth and humor between Jed Clampett and Jane Hathaway, the reality behind the scenes was far less friendly. Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen were not enemies in the traditional sense. There was no screaming, no public falling out, but the friction between them was undeniable. What made the difference was not their acting styles, but their worldviews. Buddy Ebsen leaned conservative, proud of traditional values and skeptical of the social changes sweeping through the 1960s. He wasn't shy about his opinions, and he carried them onto the set. Nancy Culp, on the other hand, held liberal views and wasn't afraid to defend them. She was outspoken, intelligent, and not someone who backed down from a debate. In an era when women were often expected to stay silent, Nancy's sharp tongue and willingness to challenge Ebsen made their clashes even more visible to those who worked closely with them. Other cast members would later recall how the two would argue, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, over politics. Their debates weren't playful sparring, they were heated, leaving tension hanging in the air long after filming wrapped. Donna Douglas, who played Ellie Mae Clampett, once mentioned that their disagreements were so constant that they became a kind of background noise on set. It was not unusual for Nancy and Buddy to show up to work still bristling from an unresolved argument. Despite their differences, both remained professionals. They knew that the Beverly Hillbillies was bigger than their personal feud. The show was pulling in millions of viewers every week, and neither was willing to jeopardize that success. So they smiled when the cameras rolled, delivered their lines with chemistry, and convinced America that Jane Hathaway and Jed Clampett had a warm working relationship. For the viewers at home, the tension remained invisible. Yet under the surface, the resentment was building. The more years they spent together on the series, the more the gap between their beliefs seemed to grow. By the time the Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Nancy and Buddy had spent nearly a decade side by side, but they were no closer to friendship than the day they met. In fact, the experience had left scars that would come back to haunt Nancy more than a decade later, from sitcom star to political underdog. After the Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Nancy Culp's career shifted. She continued to take on television guest spots, appearing in shows like Sanford and Son, Petticoat Junction, Quantum Leap, and Scarecrow and Mrs. King. She also appeared in films like Sabrina and The Parent Trap, and even returned to Broadway in productions like Mornings at 7. But to many, she was still remembered as Miss Jane Hathaway, the witty secretary with a dry sense of humor. Nancy, however, was ready for a new chapter. She had always been more than just an actress. Before Hollywood, she had been a journalist and a decorated officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve. By the early 1980s, she felt drawn to another challenge: politics. In 1984, at the age of 62, Nancy Culp announced her candidacy for a seat in the United States House of Representatives in Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District. The odds were stacked against her from the start. The district was solidly Republican, and her opponent, Bud Shuster, had already served 6 terms in Congress. Nancy was running as a Democrat in an area where her chances were slim. Still, she believed she could connect with people. She campaigned tirelessly, speaking to communities, sharing her ideas, and leaning on her reputation as someone Americans already knew from television. She made it clear that she wasn't a Hollywood outsider swooping in for attention. She was serious about representing the people of Pennsylvania. But just as Nancy was beginning to gain momentum, a familiar shadow from her past emerged. Out of nowhere, Buddy Ebsen, her old co-star from the Beverly Hillbillies, decided to enter the race. He didn't run against her directly, but in some ways, his actions cut even deeper. Buddy volunteered to record a radio ad for her opponent, Bud Shuster. In that ad, Ebsen accused Nancy of being too liberal and of using her celebrity status to sway voters. The words echoed the same debates they had waged behind the scenes years earlier. Only this time, it wasn't just a clash of opinions on a sitcom set, it was a public attack. One broadcast to voters across the district. Betrayal and defeat. Nancy Culp was no stranger to criticism. Politics was full of it. But what Buddy Ebsen did during her 1984 campaign cut differently. For nearly 10 years, they had worked together, sharing scenes week after week. They had clashed, yes, but Nancy never imagined that her former co-star would go out of his way to take sides against her. What stung most was the fact that Ebsen had no connection whatsoever to Pennsylvania. He was born in Illinois, raised in Florida, and spent most of his life in New York, New Jersey, and Hollywood. Yet here he was, inserting himself into a congressional race in a district that had nothing to do with him. When Ebsen's radio ad aired, it echoed exactly the accusations he had thrown at her years earlier on the set of the Beverly Hillbillies. In his eyes, she was too liberal, and now he was telling voters the same thing. For Nancy, it felt less like political strategy and more like a deeply personal attack, an extension of a feud that never really ended when the show went off the air. The ad damaged her campaign. Already fighting an uphill battle in a Republican stronghold, Nancy's momentum slipped. Shuster used the endorsement to his advantage, and voters who still remembered the Beverly Hillbillies took Ebsen's words seriously. By election night, the results were crushing. Bud Shuster secured 66.4% of the vote, while Nancy received only 33.6%. She had poured her energy into the campaign, but the defeat was decisive. In interviews afterward, Nancy spoke openly about how hurt she felt by Buddy's actions. She said he had no business getting involved, and that while she didn't blame him entirely for her defeat, the sting of his betrayal lingered. She admitted she never would have done the same to him, no matter how much they disagreed. It wasn't just politics. It was personal. Nancy didn't run for office again. The loss, and especially the involvement of her old colleague, made her step away from political life entirely. She left Pennsylvania for a time to clear her head, spending months with friends in California before returning. Although she insisted she had made peace with the loss, her words revealed a wound that never fully healed. What began as ideological debates on a sitcom set had ended with public humiliation on the campaign trail. The final years, and an unfinished reconciliation. After the heartbreak of her failed congressional campaign, Nancy Culp redirected her energy into something that had always brought her joy: teaching. She returned to Pennsylvania and became an artist-in-residence at Juniata College, a small liberal arts school tucked in the countryside. There, she taught acting, drawing on decades of experience in Hollywood to inspire her students. They remembered her as witty, sharp, and endlessly encouraging, a mentor who believed the stage belonged to anyone with the courage to stand on it. For Nancy, It was a quieter, more fulfilling chapter, far from the spotlight that had defined her earlier career. She also remained active in local theater, occasionally appearing on stage and even making a few late television guest spots, but her focus had shifted. She was no longer chasing Hollywood or Washington. Instead, she was creating community, passing on knowledge, and finding meaning in smaller, more personal victories. Yet her health began to decline. In 1990, Nancy was diagnosed with cancer. True to form, she faced it with determination, continuing to teach and stay engaged with her community for as long as she could. But the illness progressed quickly. On February 3, 1991, Nancy Culp died at the age of 69. Her death was mourned by former students, colleagues, and fans who still adored her as Miss Jane Hathaway. She left behind not only her body of work, but also the memory of a woman who had lived bravely, fought fiercely, and refused to be defined by one role. Buddy Ebsen, meanwhile, continued acting throughout the 1970s and 1980s, most notably in the detective series Barnaby Jones. He remained in the public eye and even enjoyed late-in-life recognition for his longevity in Hollywood. But privately, the feud with Nancy never truly left him. Toward the end of his life, he expressed regret for recording that radio ad, acknowledging that it had gone too far. Reports suggest that he and Nancy had a brief reconciliation before her passing, though they were never truly close again. It was an uneasy peace, a faint acknowledgement of what had been lost. Buddy lived a long life, passing away in 2003 at the age of 95 from complications of pneumonia. By then, he was remembered warmly by generations of fans as Jed Clampett, the kind and wise patriarch. Yet the memory of his clash with Nancy Culp remains a reminder that behind even the most beloved television families, real-life tensions can leave wounds that last a lifetime. Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen gave America laughter, but behind the scenes, their story was one of clashing ideals, public betrayal, and scars that never fully healed. She pursued politics and paid the price for their feud, while he lived long enough to feel remorse. Their tale shows that even in Hollywood, grudges can outlast fame. Do you think Buddy Ebsen went too far by getting involved in Nancy Culp's campaign, or was he simply standing by his beliefs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories.